welcome back to another episode of the Lord of the Rings AMA podcast. My name is Matthias Austin, and on this podcast, I invite you to ask me anything about Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or anything related to the greater legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I will do my best to give you as in-depth an answer as I can. Now, before we start, I want to put in just one more plug for the GoFundMe that I set up for my sister-in-law, Ashley. In case you missed it, or if this is your first episode, in which case, welcome, my sister-in-law has written a fantasy novel, and I'm going to read you the little blurb about it. The novel is called A Crown of Silver and Grey, and it's a twist on the typical late teens, early 20s Chosen One fantasy story. There's still a Chosen One, Evica North, but despite a lifetime of hoping magic would find her, her destiny didn't reveal itself until her mid-40s. When she is finally thrust into the world of magic, populated by angsty and hormonal teenage heroines and heroes, she finds herself terrified of the strange politics, horrified by mating bonds, and knees too weak to ride a dragon. But if there's one thing a life of waiting for something to happen has made her, it's stubborn. This world will be saved. It just has to happen her way. Now, I think that sounds like a really great idea for a book, a nice twist on what's kind of going around in the zeitgeist right now of fantasy stories, and we really want to get this book off of the ground. So if you want to help out to get this thing published and support a new, independent author, do me a favor and please head to the show notes and click on the link to her GoFundMe. She's an awesome person, and we want to help her out. And I know you're all going to be going to the show notes anyway, because that's where you go if you want to head to LOTRAMApod.com, where you can submit your Lord of the Rings questions. And if you do submit a question, you'll be featured on the show. Just like this week's question asker and our regular contributor, Noah from California, who asks, could you go more into the direct history of Morgoth, specifically about his fall? And by the way, if you're wondering why I'm always choosing Noah's questions, it's because I'm working through these questions in the order that they were sent. So Noah sent in a veritable barrage of questions a while back. And so if you submitted a question that I haven't answered yet, don't worry, it is coming. Now, I've talked a lot about Morgoth/Melkor throughout this show, but it's usually in context of a larger picture or somebody else's story. So this is going to be basically the devil's biography, and I might repeat certain things that I've said in other episodes, but at least now it will all be in one place. So, let's begin before the beginning, in the timeless halls of Eru Iluvatar, and we're going to go to the very first sentence of the Ainur, the music of the Ainur, which starts the entire Silmarillion book, to give us some context for who Melkor is and what drives him. This is how the Silmarillion and the Ainur opens. There was Eru, the One, who in Arda is called Iluvatar, and he made the first Ainur, the Holy Ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And then just one paragraph later, Eru speaks to the Ainur about the great music he wants them to make with him, and he says this: Of the theme that I have declared to you, I will now that ye make in harmony together a great music. And since I have kindled you with the flame imperishable, ye shall show forth your powers in adorning this theme, each with his own thoughts and devices, if he will. But I will sit and hearken, and be glad that through you great beauty has been wakened into song. And if you ever wondered what the Ainur were in a place without matter or substance, we got that answer right there from Iluvatar. They were made of the flame imperishable. And this is basically the source of life for all things with a fea, or a spirit or soul, which would be the Ainur, elves, men, and eventually dwarves. See my episode about the origins of dwarves for more on that. And so all of the Ainur begin making this music, matching and harmonizing with the theme that Eru set out for them. And it's all going swimmingly until we read this. But now Iluvatar sat and hearkened, and for a great while it seemed good to him, for in the music there were no flaws. But as the theme progressed, it came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imagining that were not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar. for he sought therein to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to himself. To Melkor among the Ainur had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all of the gifts of his brethren. He had gone often alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame, for desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own, and it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness. Yet he found not the fire, for it is with Iluvatar. But being alone, he began to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren. Now, if you've listened to episode 3 of this show, What is the Creation Mythology of Middle-earth, you know what's about to happen. Melkor introduces his own theme that doesn't fit with the rest, and then some of the Ainur start playing with him rather than with Eru and the others. And it gets messy, growing more and more cacophonous, until eventually Eru ends it with a final, terrible, climactic chord. Eru then says this to the Ainur, and specifically Melkor. Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor. But that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Iluvatar, those things that ye have sung I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined. And so here we learn Melkor is the most mighty of all the Ainur, which, if we went into the Silmarillion knowing Quenya, we would have already known that, because his name translates to he who arises in might. And now, mightiest of the Ainur has been basically called out in public. And the Silmarillion says that Melkor was filled with shame, of which came secret anger. Now again, I'm going to refer you to episode 3 for the full details of everything that happens there, but the short version is that Eru reveals that the music that they made is actually the history of Ea. Ea is the universe, and the world within it, Arda, which they see as a vision before it's taken away from them. In that vision, they get a glimpse of the children of Iluvatar, elves and men, and Melkor was very, very intrigued by them. Again, from the Silmarillion, which honestly most of my references will be today. When the Ainur had beheld this habitation in a vision, and had seen the children of Iluvatar arise therein, then many of the most mighty among them bent all their thought and their desire towards that place. And of those, Melkor was the chief, even as he was in the beginning the greatest of the Ainur who took part in the music. And he feigned, even to himself at first, that he desired to go thither and order all things for the good of the children of Iluvatar, controlling the turmoils of the heat and the cold that had come to pass through him. But he desired rather to subdue to his will both elves and men, envying the gifts with which Iluvatar promised to endow them, and he wished himself to have subjects and servants, and to be called Lord, and to be a master over other wills. But so far, this has all just been a vision. Until Eru spoke the word, Ea, let these things be, and the Ainur saw the flame imperishable, that thing that Melkor had been searching for in vain, glowing in the void, the thing that Melkor thought that Iluvatar wasn't paying attention to, and then the universe, Ea, the world that is, was born. But it was not the complete vision that they had seen, and Eru told the Ainur that they would be the ones to go and make it. And he warned that any of the Ainur that chose to enter Ea and make the world would be bound to it, unable to leave while it lasted. The Ainur entered, Melkor with them, and the most powerful of those Ainur became the Valar. And as they begin to craft and fashion the world, still as bodiless spirits it would seem, we are told, Melkor too was there from the first, and he meddled in all that was done, turning it, if he might, to his own desires and purposes, and he kindled great fires. When therefore earth was yet young and full of flame, Melkor coveted it, and he said to the other Valar, This shall be mine own kingdom, and I name it unto myself. But Manwe, who was Melkor's brother, according to the Silmarillion, in the mind of Iluvatar, stood up to him, as did the other Valar, and so Melkor left. But remember, he couldn't return to the Timeless Halls. He was still within Ea, but he left the world that they were creating, Arda. So basically, he went off into outer space. But he watched Arda from a distance, envy growing in his heart, and he saw the Valar shape the world, and then he saw them take on physical forms to walk upon it. And the Silmarillion says that Melkor saw what was done, and that the Valar walked on earth as powers visible, clad in the raiment of the world, and were lovely and glorious to see, and blissful, and that the earth was becoming as a garden for their delight, for its turmoils were subdued. His envy grew then the greater within him, and he also took visible form. But because of his mood and the malice that burned in him, that form was dark and terrible. And he descended upon Arda in power and majesty greater than any of the Valar. As a mountain that wades in the sea and has its head above the clouds and is clad in ice and crowned with smoke and fire, and the light of the eyes of Melkor was like a flame that withers with heat and pierces with a deadly cold. And this is where Melkor began to do real damage, throwing down the mountains of Aule or drying up the rivers of Ulmo, generally just causing chaos, and in some way corrupting all of creation. A concept that Tolkien referred to as Arda Mard, or the idea that all of creation in Arda was affected by Melkor's meddling. And so it could never truly be whole in the way that it was meant to be. Melkor kind of had the mindset of, if I can't have it, no one can. Or to put it another way, Tolkien wrote in an essay that Christopher Tolkien put in Book 10 of the History of Middle-earth, Morgoth's Ring. The title comes from an essay where Tolkien wrote that just as Sauron concentrated his power in the One Ring, Morgoth, Melkor, we'll get to the name change eventually, dispersed his power into the very matter of Arda. Thus, the whole of Middle-earth was Morgoth's ring. So in Book 10, Morgoth's Ring, in a chapter called Myths Transformed, Tolkien wrote this about Melkor's motivations. Melkor had no plan, unless destruction and reduction to nil of a world in which he had only a share can be called a plan. In other places, Tolkien referred to Melkor as a nihilist seeking only destruction due to his rage that he was not the ruler of everything. And his war against the Valar and their works was devastating. And for a long time, and time's a kind of hard concept to determine here because it was passing, but how it was kept was kind of just done by vibes. I talk about that in my episode about what's beyond the map and other questions. Check it out. Anyway, Melkor was clearly winning in this fight, until help came unlooked for from the Timeless Halls. And perhaps this might even be the first instance of eucatastrophe. When one of the Ainur who had remained with Iluvatar, seeing the destruction that Melkor was causing, chose to descend to Arda. And his name was Tulkas, and this is what the Silmarillion says happens when he arrived. So came Tulkas the Strong, whose anger passes like a mighty wind, scattering cloud and darkness before it. And Melkor fled before his wrath and his laughter, and forsook Arda, and there was peace for a long age. And Tulkas remained and became one of the Valar of the kingdom of Arda. But Melkor brooded in the outer darkness, and his hate was given to Tulkas forever after. So while he was again spying on them from space, and I can't think of what the outer darkness might mean other than just space, but I might be wrong. Tolkien actually wrote in a footnote to an essay on the void, found in Myths Transformed, he wrote, "The minds of men were inclined to confuse the void," and then this is a note by me, sometimes called the outer dark, back to Tolkien, as a conception of the state of non-being outside of creation or Ea. They confuse that with the conception of vast spaces within Ea, especially those conceived to lie all about the enisled, and note by me again, enisled is a word I didn't know, but it means isolated, like an island. They're conceived to lie all about the enisled kingdom of Arda. So yeah, I am but a man. I might be getting some of this confused here, but it seems to me that he's watching from outer space. So he's watching from space as the Valar finish creating Arda. though not in accordance with their original designs because of all of Melkor's meddling. And he's watching them build these tall pillars, one in the north, one in the south, that gave light to the world. And he watched them settle on the island of Almaren in the very center of the Great Lake at the very center of the earth. But Melkor had spies. The Silmarillion says that Melkor knew all that was done, for even then he had secret friends and spies among the Maiar, whom he had converted to his cause, and far off in the darkness he was filled with hatred, being jealous of the work of his peers, whom he desired to make subject to himself. Therefore he gathered to himself spirits out of the halls of Ea that he had perverted to his service, and he deemed himself strong. Now, I mentioned in my episode on Sauron that it is likely Sauron was one of, if not the chief, spy. And Melkor's opportunity arrived when Tulkas married Nessa. And after the wedding festivities, it says that Tulkas slept and the Valar had their guard down. And when their guard was down, Melkor snuck into Arda with his allied Maiar, which were like the Balrogs and things like that, and in the very, very far north, they tunneled deep beneath the mountains, hiding in the dark beneath the earth in a fortress called Utumno, which translates to deep hidden in Quenya. And the Valar didn't notice anything was wrong until it was too late. The corruption of Melkor began to spread southward, creating swamps and fens, and it twisting the animals created by Yavanna into these monstrous beasts. The Valar realized too late that something had gone horribly wrong, but before they could find Melkor, he attacked the Pillar of the North, and to quote the Silmarillion, Melkor, trusting in the strength of Utumno and the might of his servants, came forth suddenly to war, and struck the first blow, ere the Valar were prepared. And he assailed the lights of Iluin and Ormal, and he cast down their pillars and broke their lamps. In the overthrow of the mighty pillars, lands were broken and seas arose in tumult. And when the lamps were spilled, destroying flame was poured all over the earth. And the shape of Arda and the symmetry of its waters and its lands were marred in that time, so that the first designs of the Valar were never after restored. And while the other Valar tried to salvage as much as they could of the world that they had made, Tulkas sought out Melkor. But he had returned to Utumno, and he was able to hide from his pursuer. Fearing the outcome on Arda if they were to fully go to war, and especially being concerned that any fighting could harm the yet-to-be-seen children of Iluvatar, elves and men, the Valar withdrew to the west across the newly formed sea, to the land the elves called Aman, the Blessed Realm, which they guarded against attack with great mountains called the Pelori, and they lit Aman with the light of the two trees. And I actually talk about that in my episode about the two trees. Check it out. I'm doing a lot of references back to previous episodes. And now with the Valar living in the west, in the land of Aman, full of light and peace, and Melkor living in the east, in a land of darkness and corruption called Endor, which we more commonly know as Middle-earth, and the arrival of the elves nearly upon us, we will take a quick break.
Welcome to the Ex-Baptist Sisters podcast. I'm Vicky.
And this is Tanya.
And we are two sisters haphazardly deconstructing our cult-like religious past in an IFB church setting.
That's Independent Fundamental Baptist.
Our desire is to center each episode around a given topic, but at the end of the day, we're just two sisters hanging out.
We will have a chosen topic each episode to educate people with no church background, and also just give fellow survivors an opportunity to share their stories.
The wind is blowing, the rain is coming down, and here we are on someone's porch trying to lead them to Christ. It was like a business.
But we weren't getting paid. We were in the sales department, but our treasures were in heaven, as they like to say.
We're talking to strangers, and then the strangers are sending their kids with strangers to a building they've never been to go to church.
That's how we first got pulled into the cult, was somebody knocked on our door and invited just the kids to come to Sunday school and ride the bus.
So enjoy your front row seat for every tangent and every story, and share yours too at exbaptistsisters@gmail.com. Join us each week as we unpack suppressed memories and share the path we took to leave a strict, oppressive religion and find peace, healing, and joy on the other side. Check out the Ex-Baptist Sisters podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Bye.
And we're back. So, the Valar and Melkor are separated, and the Silmarillion says, "In the north of Middle-earth, Melkor built his strength, and he slept not, but watched and labored, and the evil things that he had perverted walked abroad, and the dark and slumbering woods were haunted by monsters and shapes of dread. And in Utumno he gathered his demons about him, those spirits who first adhered to him in the days of his splendor, and became most like him in his corruption. Their hearts were of fire, but they were cloaked in darkness, and terror went before them. They had whips of flame, Balrogs they were named in Middle-earth in later days. And in that dark time Melkor bred many other monsters of diverse shapes and kinds that long troubled the world, and his realm spread now ever southward over Middle-earth. And Melkor made also a fortress and armory not far from the northwestern shores of the sea, to resist any assault that might come from Aman. That stronghold was commanded by Sauron, lieutenant of Melkor, and it was named Angband." But not all of the Valar abandoned Middle-earth, and at different times Yavanna would come across the sea to tend to the plants, and Ulmo still swam in all of the waters of the world, and most importantly to this story, Orome the Hunter would mount his great horse and with his hounds come to Middle-earth seeking out the monsters of Melkor. And on one occasion he came across the elves, but he was not the first of the Ainur to do so. The Silmarillion tells us that Melkor ever watchful was first aware of the awakening of the Quendi, or the elves, and sent shadows and evil spirits to spy among them and waylay them. So it came to pass, some years ere the coming of Orome, that if any of the elves strayed far abroad, alone or few together, they would often vanish and never return. And the Quendi said that the hunter had caught them, and they were afraid. And indeed the most ancient songs of the elves, of which echoes are remembered still in the west, tell of the shadow shapes that walked in the hills above Cuiviénen, or would pass suddenly over the stars, and of the dark rider upon his wild horse that pursued those that wandered to take them and devour them. Now Melkor greatly hated and feared the riding of Orome, and either he sent indeed his dark servants as riders, or he set lying whispers abroad for the purpose that the Quendi should shun Orome if ever they should meet. And if you've listened to my episode on orcs, another reference to a previous episode, you'll know that this was a contentious point that Tolkien wrestled with, and in some versions of the story, those captured elves were transformed and bred into the first orcs. But as the Silmarillion is the closest to canon that we're going to get, we'll go with it. Orome did find the elves, and because of Melkor's influence, many did hide, but the rest stayed, and Orome thought, "Oh dang, I gotta go tell the other Valar, we need to keep these guys safe." So returning to Aman, he laid out the case that they needed to do something about Melkor before he harmed the elves. And after some debate, Manwë, leader of the Valar, said, "This is the counsel of Iluvatar in my heart, that we should take up again the mastery of Arda at whatsoever cost, and deliver the Quendi from the shadow of Melkor." Then Tulkas was glad, but Aule was grieved, foreboding the hurts of the world that must come of that strife. But the Valar made ready, and came forth from Aman in strength of war, resolving to assault the fortresses of Melkor and make an end. Never did Melkor forget that this war was made for the sake of the elves, and that they were the cause of his downfall. So the Valar send some Maiar, which were actually the wizards, but before they took on physical bodies, to go protect the elves during this great war as they invaded the land of Middle-earth. And in the war that followed, Utumno, along with all of the lands around it, was utterly destroyed. And the servants of Melkor who survived the war fled, including Sauron. We are told, "The gates of Utumno were broken and the halls unroofed, and Melkor took refuge in the uttermost pit. Then Tulkas stood forth as champion of the Valar, and wrestled with him, and cast him upon his face, and he was bound with the chain Angenor, and that Aule had wrought, and led captive, and the world had peace for a long age. When the battle was ended, and from the ruin of the north great clouds arose and hid the stars, the Valar drew Melkor back to Valinor, bound hand and foot, and blindfold, and he was brought to the Ring of Doom. There he lay upon his face before the feet of Manwë and sued for pardon. But his prayer was denied, and he was cast into prison in the fastness of Mandos, whence none can escape, neither Vala, nor elf, nor mortal man. Vast and strong are those halls, and they were built in the west of the land of Aman. There was Melkor doomed to abide for 3 ages long before his cause should be tried anew, or he should plead again for pardon. Now, reading this, it would seem that Melkor was just simply overpowered by Tolkien. But Tolkien clarified in Myths Transformed that it's not just because the Valar are inherently more powerful than him. In fact, he wrote that Melkor was the greatest power under Eru, and that combined the Valar shouldn't be able to take him. But because Melkor can't create, only Iluvatar can. In order to transform and corrupt the world and the beasts and the orcs, he had to disperse his power into his minions, weakening him. And that's why Tolkien was able to actually take him captive. Now, a lot happens outside of the Halls of Mandos during Melkor's captivity, which I cover in other episodes. And by the time Melkor is released, the Eldar, the 3 houses of elves made up of the Vanyar, Noldor, and Teleri, have now immigrated to Aman. And in the Silmarillion, we read that after Melkor's release, he was brought before the Valar. And it says, "Then he looked upon their glory and their bliss, and envy was in his heart. He looked upon the children of Iluvatar that sat at the feet of the mighty, and hatred filled him. He looked upon the wealth of bright gems, and he lusted for them. But he hid his thoughts, and postponed his vengeance. Before the gates of Valmar, Melkor abased himself at the feet of Manwë and sued for pardon, vowing that if he might be made only the least of the free people of Valinor, he would aid the Valar in all their works, and most of all in the healing of the many hurts that he had done to the world. And Nienna aided his prayer, but Mandos was silent. Then Manwë granted him pardon." So now free with a heart full of hatred, Melkor began to look for ways he could ruin the peace of Aman. And while the Vanyar and the Teleri wanted nothing to do with him, he was able to ingratiate himself with many of the Noldor, teaching them many things about crafting and smithing and his knowledge of the world. And while he taught them, he began a whisper campaign, spreading rumors, lies, and half-truths to sow dissension. The Silmarillion says that visions he would conjure in their hearts of the mighty realms that they could have ruled at their own will, in power and freedom in the east, and then whispers went abroad that the Valar had brought the Eldar to Aman because of their jealousy, fearing that the beauty of the Quendi and the Maker's power that Iluvatar had bequeathed to them would grow too great for the Valar to govern, as the elves waxed and spread over the wide lands of the world. Now Melkor, of the Noldor, most wanted to corrupt Feanor, the greatest, but not best, elf to ever live, because he wanted to take the Silmarils, which Feanor had made, which contained within them the light of the 2 trees. But Feanor hated Melkor, he never trusted him, and he wouldn't even speak with him. But the rumors that Melkor started eventually reached Feanor, and they began to work on him, and he didn't know that they came from Melkor, until he began to grow proud and paranoid. Melkor then started new rumors that Feanor's half-brothers, Fingolfin and Finarfin, were planning to usurp Feanor as heir to Finwë, king of the Noldor, and Feanor crafted the first weapons made by the elves in order to, in his mind, defend himself against his scheming half-siblings. From the Silmarillion. Thus with lies and evil whisperings and false counsel, Melkor kindled the hearts of the Noldor to strife, and of their quarrels came at length the end of the high days of Valinor and the evening of its ancient glory. For Feanor now began openly to speak words of rebellion against the Valar, crying aloud that he would depart from Valinor back to the world without, and would deliver the Noldor from thraldom if they would follow him. And all of that culminates with a confrontation where Feanor drew his sword on Fingolfin and publicly threatened to kill him, at which point the Valar realized that something had gone horribly wrong, and they put Feanor under house arrest in the Noldor city of Formenos for a year, and Finwë, his father, voluntarily went with him. And after dealing with Feanor, they started investigating why all of this had happened, and they realized that Melkor was the one who had started the rumors. And Tolkien, he went to track him down, but the Silmarillion says that Melkor, knowing that his devices had been revealed, hid himself and passed from place to place as a cloud in the hills, and Tolkien sought for him in vain. So there are benefits sometimes to being able to become just a spirit instead of a physical form, though the days of Melkor being able to do that were rapidly coming to an end. Melkor eluded capture for the better part of a year, until one day he appeared at Formenos and spoke to Feanor, saying, "Behold the truth of all that I have spoken, and how thou art banished unjustly. But if the heart of Feanor is yet free and bold as were his words, then I will aid him and bring him far from this narrow land. For am I not Vala also?" And Feanor was almost convinced, Melkor had almost convinced him, until Melkor went one step too far and said, "Here is a strong place and well guarded, but think not that the Silmarils will lie safe in any treasury within the realm of the Valar." And this set off all of Feanor's alarms, and he realized that Melkor wanted the Silmarils for himself. And Feanor slammed the door in Melkor's face with a dismissive laugh, not realizing the enemy that he had just made. In a rage, Melkor fled the land of Aman before he could be found, but he didn't cross the sea back to Middle-earth. Between the Pelori Mountains and the sea, there was this narrow strip of desolate land that stretched away to the south, called Avathar, which means shadows in Quenya, because the mountains were blocking the light from the trees and it cast these long dark shadows across the beaches, or, as it's described in the Silmarillion, there, beneath the sheer walls of the mountain and the cold dark sea, the shadows were deepest and thickest in the world. And it was there that Melkor met Ungoliant, with whom he would hatch a plan to get his revenge on Valar and elves, and it would earn him a new name, Morgoth Bauglir, the dark foe of the earth. But that will need to wait until next week's episode, so make sure you come back for part 2. That's right, this will be a two-parter. I put out a poll on social media, and the results were overwhelmingly to have 2 normal-length episodes rather than one jumbo one. And I might, in the future, utilize my social media for more polls, or for taking topic suggestions for, my weekly shorter videos, maybe doing, some short AMAs. So, if you want your voice to be heard, head over to LOTRAMApod.com and find links to all of my social media. And now, let's take another quick break for a word from our next sponsor.
Hi, my name is Peter, and I'm a professor of ethics and host of the podcast Things You Can Do. It's a really weird, stressful, confusing time in the world right now, especially if you live in the United States. Sometimes it can be really hard to know what the right thing to do is in a situation where you aren't even sure if your choices matter. I mean, just how can our little life make any impact on protests or violence or domestic policy or global climate change? But I want to encourage you that every choice you make, from the most mundane, everyday routine to the most extraordinary, once-in-a-lifetime moments, all add up into the kind of person you are trying to become. If you're trying to become someone who is thoughtful about how you treat people, about the positive and negative impacts of your choices, and about the best way to make your actions reflect your most deeply held values, come on over and have a listen to some of the things we talk about on Things You Can Do, available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
And we're back with another installment of News from Arda. We begin our news with a retraction and a correction. In last week's episode, I reported that Elijah Wood had indicated that British actor Leo Woodall would be playing a young Aragorn in the Andy Serkis-helmed The Hunt for Gollum. However, this was incorrect. Leo Woodall will be in the film, but not in the role of Aragorn. Warner Brothers announced at CinemaCon this week a partial cast list, revealing that the role of Aragorn will be played by Northern Irish actor Jamie Dornan, star of Belfast and 50 Shades of Grey. Leo Woodall will be playing a character not found in the books, named Halvard, who according to The Hollywood Reporter is another Dunedain Ranger of the North. Kate Winslet will also be playing a new character, though no details have been confirmed as to who Marigold is, that's her character's name, and whether she's human, hobbit, or elf. The cast, as we have previously mentioned, will also feature returning actors Elijah Woods as Frodo, Ian McKellen as Gandalf, Andy Serkis as Gollum, and they just announced that Lee Pace will be reprising his role of Thranduil from the Hobbit films. The film has a release date of December 17, 2027, and we will have more updates on this and all other developments in the world of Middle-earth next time on News from Arda. And now we will turn once more to
This Week in Middle-earth.
On April 15, in the year 2510 of the Third Age, the armies of Gondor meet an overwhelming force of orcs and Easterlings on the field of Celebrant, and are nearly defeated. But Eorl the Young, leading the riders of the Eothed from the north, arrive in the nick of time to turn the tide of the battle. In thanks, Cirion, the steward of Gondor, grants Eorl and his people the land of Calenarthon for their own, and the kingdom of Rohan is born. And other than that one history-shaping day, there's not much more for
This Week in Middle-earth.
Thank you again to Noah for his question, and to all of you for listening. I've said it before, I'm sure I'm going to say this again in the future, but I'm just having such a great time making this show. I thought I knew about Middle-earth before I started, and each week I'm blown away by how much more there is to learn, and without all of you listening and sending in questions, I probably wouldn't be setting aside the several hours a week that I need to do my research. So, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to build my own knowledge about this world. And if you're looking for a way to thank me for the show, which you by no means have to, your listening is enough, but if you want to, you can always leave a 5-star rating and review on whatever platform you use to listen. You can even leave a comment on Spotify episodes, or if you listen on YouTube. You can submit questions, so I have more things to talk about and research. And maybe, most importantly, you can tell a friend about the show. And if you really, really want to go above and beyond, you can always click the coffee cup on my website to donate to the show. Links for all of that can be found at LOTRAMApod.com. And please check out that link in the show notes for the GoFundMe for Ashley's book. Even just to read about her and the story she wrote. It's really cool, and in a time when the world can seem dark, it's art and stories that keep us going. It's why everybody's always singing in Tolkien's world, right? So if you'd like to help a storyteller get on her feet, check out that link. And of course, thank you as always to our friends over at Things You Can Do and the Ex-Baptist Sisters podcast. And thank you to Lauren for our artwork and Michael for our music. And that's all for this week. Iluvatar willing, I'll be back next week. See you then.